Welcome everyone to our first spring book event, and we are absolutely thrilled to have with us today Peter Cappelli. And Peter is going to talk to us about his new book on a very timely topic, the future of the office. We are going to begin in a minute, but first let me do a couple of introductory introductory points. First of all, I'm Anna Tevis, Academic Director and Clinical Professor here at NYU School of Professional Studies, and I look after Human Capital Management Department in the Division of the Programs in Business. So we are absolutely thrilled to have Peter Cappelli with us here. Next slide. And Peter is a George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton Business School, and he's also the Director for Human Resources, Center for Human Resources at Wharton School. Peter is a prolific writer, researcher, commentator on issues that have to do with the workplace, and there's nothing that has been changing faster in a much in a very dynamic way at the time of the pandemic than our workplace itself. And with the launch of this book, Peter is going to share with us his thinking, the research, as well as observations based on many years of experience in this field, of what we should be thinking about and how we should be thinking about the office that's yet to come. And we were just chatting in the green room here before launching the webinar about the book. Peter finished the book in January, I think, Peter, thinking that we will be all set to be in that next generation office. But with a delay in the pandemic, the topic of what the future of the office is going to be remains to be front and center and very, very topical. And as organizations are beginning or continuing to be making these decisions, I think Peter's wisdom and experience could be very helpful in guiding us how we should be thinking about our workplace. Peter, without further ado, please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It's nice to virtually see some of you. Remember when we used to say, oh gosh, I haven't seen you in years, and it was hyperbole? Well, I haven't seen Anna in years. So it's kind of true for everybody, right? We just haven't seen each other. And that's probably a good place to start. You know, if you think back on March 2020, right, which is 2 years ago, when the disruptions from the pandemic began in the US. And if you had told me, and maybe it's true of you too, that we would have this thing for 2 years and we would be shutting down much of society for a long time, offices would all be closed, you know, I would have thought we'd be living in caves and burning our furniture for heat, you know. I mean, it's just amazing that we are doing as well as we are. It's amazing what we can get used to, I suppose, you know, and adapt. And, you know, I think people are just far more adaptable than we think. But, you know, this has been, let's not kid ourselves, this has been an unbelievable societal level event, which generations from now, I think people will look back on much the same way they did wars, you know, and the pandemic of 2018, which was the US experience with the last big one. I mean, it's just incredible. And, you know, what we're wondering now, of course, is what happens next, which is what we want to talk about, right? So let me begin with this, with an example, which you might be familiar with, but, you know, Google, you sort of have to have a Google story in every talk these days. It's kind of required, right? In the last few years, Google is the company that most young people say they want to work for. And that's true even in countries where Google doesn't employ anybody, right? And, you know, part of that is because they did such a good job persuading us and explaining to us all the wonderful things that happened at the office. And their mission was to get people who work for them to stay in the office. It wasn't hours of work per se. It was they wanted you to do the work in the office, and you got a stipend if you would locate your residence closer to the campus. And as we probably all know, they did all these fancy things for you. They would do your laundry, they would walk your dog, you could get massages, anything to keep you there. And lots of other companies started to copy that. We thought that the face-to-face in person was really the way to get productivity and creativity, especially, right? And as of about, maybe it's now 2 months ago, time's moving on, they announced this, that you probably know, that they told 20% of their workforce that they could just go away, work wherever you want. You don't need to ever come into the office again. Another 20% were told they could move wherever they want as long as they were close enough to get sort of near a Google office any place on the planet. The remaining 60% were told that 1 month out of the year, and that's not your vacation time, you could just pick up and go work for wherever you want. And the rest of the time, you could be in this kind of hybrid mode, which I think they settled on 2 days a week, remote, and the rest of the time in the office, right? So, what do we think about this? Does this mean they were wrong the first time? That whole effort to get everybody in the office and keep them there, that was just a big oopsie? Or is something else going on? And if that wasn't puzzling enough, here's the other thing that you guys in New York probably know, that they have been snapping up commercial real estate office space in New York. And so have the other tech companies that were leading the charge to remote work. You could work wherever you want, So what's going on with these companies? They're not saying, you probably all have your own guess. My guess is that they were all competing to not be the last mover, so that they weren't the last company not allowing their employees to work remotely, because this has proved pretty popular with people for reasons we're going to talk about in a minute. But this particular example tells us a little bit about companies and employers in general trying to figure out what the heck are they doing going forward, right? Well, all the story is about what the employees want, right? And the press on this has been focused on this idea, particularly permanent remote work. Now, this is a slightly dated survey. This is something McKinsey did in the summer of this last year. And that's why when you see the second bar, the second row that says post-COVID-19, that was in the summer when it looked like we were coming out of this, and it was, just a matter of time. And Labor Day, remember when people thought we'd all be back in the office Labor Day, and they meant 2020 Labor Day, and then it was 2021 Labor Day. Well, here's the interesting thing about it, right? That even a year and a half into the pandemic, after a year and a half of working remotely, only 11% of people wanted to work remote, and that was up by 3 percentage points from before the pandemic, which is not that much, right? And you would never believe that if you listen to the media accounts, right, where we think everybody has moved to Santa Fe or someplace else that sounds like a fun place to be. The other thing just to remember is that there are a lot of people, even though the number has changed, that really want to be back in the office, right? And we forget that. And that complicates things a lot, because not everybody wants the same thing. And hybrid is probably the most popular for sure. And my guess is that the numbers are probably much bigger than 52% here. But hybrid is just everything, right? Other than being in the office completely or being home completely. So of course, most people are going to want something in the middle, right? But the punchline for us here is that not everybody wants the same thing. And it's not as useful for everybody to be remote, even hybrid remote, depending on where you are in your career, for reasons we're going to talk about in a minute, like right now, right? So let's start out by seeing whether we can outline what some of the issues are. And I should say at the beginning that I'm pretty skeptical about most claims about new stuff going on. There's no doubt the pandemic is a new thing. There's no doubt working from home is a new thing, right? But there's an awful lot of assumptions being made about it. And my goal in this book largely is to make sure we all understand what the issues are and what the questions are and what kinds of things we know and what kinds of things we don't know. One of the things we haven't spent a lot of time trying to figure out is, why is it that people who prefer to work remotely prefer it? And overall, the surprising thing looking at surveys of employees is that they seemed happier with their work working remotely on pretty much all dimensions. So there's kind of an assumption, that, well, this is because we don't have to commute. And that's all from the perspective of people who live in the suburbs with kids mainly, right? But not everybody does. Not everybody has a terrible commute. My commute was a walk to work, didn't save me a lot of time to not have to go into the office, right? The experience is pretty different depending on who you are. Let's say you're a young college graduate, you just got offered a job in New York City, and your boss calls you up and says to you, "Great news, Peter. You don't have to come into the office. We're closing it. You can work from home in Iowa." You think they're going to applaud for that? I don't think so, right? And for new employees, the experience of not having an office to go to is pretty hard if you're trying to figure out what to do. For people like many of us who've been working in the same place for a long time, it's not that hard to work remote. But if you've never been there before, and if you've never been in an office before, it's quite complicated to figure out what to do. Just this quick anecdote at the very beginning. This is U.S. Department of Transportation evidence finding that commuting is certainly down, but driving time for people working remotely is not down as much as you would think. So the idea that this might save the planet turns out not to be true, because people who are remote workers are driving more during the week. They're running more errands. To some extent, they're doing the kind of things they may have done at their office before during lunch, drop off, dry cleaning, that kind of stuff. They're just doing it at a different point in time, and they're driving maybe further while they're doing that, right? So that was a little bit of a surprise. Here's what I think we're not paying enough attention to. I think people liked the remote experience because they were managed differently by their bosses, that they were given a whole lot more autonomy over what they did and how they did it. And there was a whole lot more trust going on. There was also a sense that we're pulling together to try to keep our companies afloat or the society afloat, depending on what your work is, right? And people reported higher levels of commitment, higher levels of engagement. They liked their supervisors better, right? And that's not simply because they don't see them, which is the cynical view, which of course, what I was thinking first. I think it's because they had different kinds of conversations with their supervisors that were really work focused, and they weren't being micromanaged, right? Now, here's the kicker from that, though. After the pandemic begins to pull away, it's looking like, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, that we have a sense of what it might look like afterwards. Working from home is not going to be the same thing. There's a big difference between a context where everybody has to work remotely and a context where we're asking people to raise their hand and say, would you like to work from home, right? We know an awful lot about that we haven't quite paid enough attention to. So we've been studying telecommuters since the days of smog in Los Angeles in the 1970s. And the conclusions from those studies, and there's, maybe a half a dozen ones that are quite good, experimental design, pretty clever and stuff. The people who are working at home when their colleagues are in the office do worse on every dimension of their career, on every dimension of their work experience. They're less committed to the organizations, they're less engaged, they don't get promoted as quickly, they don't make as much money. That may sound like, or couldn't possibly be, but imagine the thought experiment here that you have an identical twin doing the same job that you're doing in the same organization. They've decided to be in the office with the bosses all the time, and you're going to stay home and never be there. Now, which one of you think is going to get ahead faster, right? So that's something we need to keep in mind. If you are one of those people raising your hand and saying, I want to work remotely, you will probably pay a price for doing that, right? Unless we figure out how to manage organizations differently, and it's possible that'll happen, but as we say in Philadelphia, God bless, which means good luck with that, because the odds on it happening are probably not going to be so great. The other thing we haven't thought very much about is what's the employer's interest in this, right? Because let's not kid ourselves. The employers have all the marbles in this game. Employees want lots of things they never get. And unless the employers think it's in their interest to do something, they're not going to do it. So what do we know about this? Well, the CFOs like the idea of permanent remote work because they're going to take your office back and shrink real estate. And they like nothing better than shrinking down the cost base, right? So in March of 2020, surveys of CFOs, said, I think the figure was 34%, but maybe it was higher than that, said a few weeks into the pandemic that they were already planning to shrink their footprint down, right? To get rid of more commercial real estate. So that's pretty clear, but that only works for permanent remote workers. The idea of a hybrid, and some companies are trying this idea of hoteling again. In Europe, they call it hot desking. This was something that we tried and became popular in Silicon Valley after the dot-com period, and it almost completely failed. There were articles a few years later by 2007 saying, whatever happened to hoteling? And the reason it failed is people hated it. And the reason they hated it is they didn't just want a space in the office where they could plug into the IT system. Now you don't need that, right? They wanted to see their colleagues, they wanted to be around their colleagues, and they like having their own space, right? Here's the other thing I think that's happening in Silicon Valley. I think, frankly, they're walking back this promise that you could work remotely, and they're doing it by making people who want to do it pay a price, take a pay cut, right? And what I'm hearing from those folks is the pay cut is getting to look something like 20%, right? So you want to work remotely, not come into the office, fine, but it's going to cost you 20%. And there are all kinds of, frankly, silly explanations as to why, like, well, we're going to pay you based on the labor market where you're working. But, you know, if you decide to move to, let's say, Aspen, there's no separate labor market for C++ mobile app programmers who are doing the kind of work you're doing in Silicon Valley in Aspen. So come on, let's, you know, who are we kidding on this, right? There is a view on the employer side that maybe this would allow them to recruit from cheaper parts of the world. They could probably do this already, but just to be clear, you could hire a remote worker and make them an employee, not a contractor, anywhere in the world. You don't need a visa. As long as they don't come to the US to do their work, you could probably do that. It sounds like a great idea to some companies until they are reminded that, you know, other people can do the same thing to your employees too. So if we go down this path, you know, it's going to be job hopping for work like that, mainly IT work, that's just really extreme, right? A big thing we want to think about with hybrid in particular is managing two systems at the same time. Let's come back to that in just a second. It is possible that employers will have to do this because so many of their competitors want to, that they'll have no choice, right? So let's come back to that thought in just a second. But first, let's talk about hybrid, which of course is what everybody's talking about. If you're an employer and you're thinking about giving people choice, the first problem to recognize is the management challenge from that is pretty big. So you're managing, let's say, some workers who are going to be permanently remote. Some are going to be in the office almost all the time. Others are going to be in and out. And your job is to manage those people in very different arrangements. They need very different things. You know, if people are working remote, they need a lot more help from their supervisors, basically in kind of intelligence, managing stakeholders in the office, all that kind of stuff. So can supervisors who are already squeezed incredibly, right? Too many people to supervise, too many other things to do. They're supposed to manage both groups at the same time and treat them differently but fairly. You know, that's a pretty big challenge. Agile, remember, was a big deal just before the pandemic, and Anna and I tried to talk to people about that, and it's really hard to do that remotely. I don't think we've seen any clear evidence that you can do it nearly as well remotely. People want flexibility, and that's something to bear in mind. I think we'll talk more about this in just a minute, but the question about flexibility is going to be, how does this help the employer? It complicates their lives a lot, right? Doesn't save office space. You're trying to hold meetings, and the idea about meetings, if you do them face to face, is you want people to be in touch with each other, but some people won't be there because it's their day to be remote or something like that. And then we're half and half again. And does that help very much, right? If people are hybrid, it is harder to onboard new people because it takes a longer time to meet the other people. You know, everything just becomes more complicated. Let's come back to this issue of striking a balance here in a minute. But if you don't think this is an issue that is challenging, imagine this problem. You say, okay, you can raise your hand if you'd like to work from home. Who's more interested in that? I think there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be people who have caregiver responsibilities, who need the flexibility more. That group is probably going to be disproportionately women compared to the rest of your employee base. As we just explained to you before, the evidence is overwhelming that people in that circumstance don't do as well in their careers, okay? So can you say with me, class action lawsuit? Because you've just set yourself up for that. Unless you can figure out how to treat those two groups equally, the group remote, the group in the office, and one of those groups has an ability to sue you that the other groups don't, you're staring down something that's pretty big. Okay, let me do just a little level setting here as to where we are in the pandemic and work from home per se. This is February 1st. This was in the New York Times. Give them a cite for this, but it's CDC data. You can see the big spike from Omicron virus there. That's the red line. But the big thing is that the death rate did not go up nearly so much, nor did hospitalization, despite the fact that so many more people were sick. And what it appears, at least with this new virus, as opposed to the older classic COVID, right, is that this is primarily a problem of the unvaccinated. And that having COVID with Omicron now is not necessarily a hospital trip, right? In fact, for most people, it's not. And particularly for people who are vaccinated, it is not. It's looking more like the flu, which is way better than it was before. These vaccination differences are astonishing, right? So your odds of dying from COVID now are 20 times higher if you're unvaccinated. And being hospitalized, which is one of the big concerns, we're overwhelming the hospital system with these folks. The incidence of being hospitalized is about 8 times the incidence of if you are vaccinated, right? So it's looking now like the story is quite different. And that is the burden of the unvaccinated on society is becoming a big issue. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Like right now, look at this data from Gallup, which is showing you a percentage of employees, how they feel about a mandate for employees to be vaccinated. And you can see the numbers saying strongly favoring over this last year going up and up. Well, sort of hits a peak in September. We haven't seen where it goes in January yet, right? But it's up a lot, right? The people who strongly oppose it, almost no change because, for better or for worse, those aren't really evidence-based ideas that are driving that, right? But the evidence-based things on is this a good deal in terms of saving lives seems to be going up, right? So public support for mandates is going up. At least from this Gallup data, which asked employees about how many employers have it, it's a little over a third, 36% of US employers, according to their employees, have a vaccine mandate already, which is a lot higher than I thought, okay? Now let's get down to the back to office. Where do we stand right now? Stunning data to me from the City of London. That's that 1 square mile of the financial district, right? That 70% of those folks are in their offices. And this is proximity-based data. That one is from Google tracking. Nationally in the US, this is from card swipe data. So this is about as good as you're going to get, right? 40% of people were back in their offices a month ago. And that might not sound like a lot, except in a typical day before the pandemic, it was only 75 or 80%, right? Because some days some people are out on a given day anyway. So that's pretty high. It dropped really quickly in January because of the Omicron variant. We sent a lot of people home. And this back and forth, maybe this will go on a little bit. But here's something I want you to take a guess at. And the guess is, what percentage of people right now in the US do you think are working remotely? Let me tell you, the answer comes from census data. So again, this is about as good as you're going to get, right? And you might guess yourself, a very common guess is 50%, which sounds like a safe guess, but the answer is actually 15%, right? So far fewer people are working remotely than we might think. You can see the red state, blue state divide in the chart on the left, right? The metro comparisons. This is again card swipe data. This is earlier in the fall, but you can see San Francisco about 20%, a little more than that. In Austin, Texas, about 48% are back in the office. So we're seeing this sharp divide based on political region, I guess, right? Here's just some interesting data on questions we're all wondering about, and that is time spent. Are people working longer hours, working remotely? The answer seems to be yes, and probably longer than any savings in commuting time. The thing that stuns me is this middle finding here, that we have a 27% increase in time spent in meetings. I think a lot of people thought that once we went virtual, it would cut down on meetings, but apparently it is not. Apparently it has gone up, which is surprising and a little disappointing. This last chart here is about return to office issues and the belief by employees that their employers will do the right thing. So the higher the number is, the more people disagreeing with that, right? So people more or less were pretty confident that their employer is going to do the right thing in bringing people back, and not so much now. This is post-Omicron variant here. I think some of that is simply because of so much uncertainty. Some of it, though, I think is because a lot of employers, I feel, listening in, are not talking so much to their employees about it. They're getting tired of, just telling them what they think they're going to do. But I think not talking to your employees is a bad thing. Even if what you're telling them is, we don't know what we're going to do, we've got to think about this. Here's what we're looking at and trying to keep track of, and we'll keep you posted when we learn something, right? I think that's much better, because if you're not talking to them, they assume you got some plan and you're just not telling them about it because it's so bad. Here's a little thing about ways to move forward on this. This is a nice, clever survey done by PwC. It asked employees who were working remotely, I think was the punchline here, what would you give up? What would you do to get a 10% wage cut, right? And you can see the kinds of things that they were most willing to take a pay cut to get. And the top four are all about control over my time, right? Which is really interesting. If you're an employer, now you start to see, wow, maybe this could be useful as a recruiting device, maybe as a retention device, right? Last thing I want to say just for a minute here is this thing about great resignation and our employees behaving differently. And let me just tell you the punchline here. Not so much, really. There's a surprising amount of hype about this. The most vacancies ever, yes, it's true. But it's also true that we have the most jobs ever, so that's not too surprising. It's also true that we've only been collecting the data for 20 years, so it's not ever, it's not the right answer, it's the last 20 years. The other thing which we forget is there's always a lot of turnover. So compare July 2021, when this was really a big question, the Great Resignation. If you compared it to July just before the pandemic, it went from 2.4% to 2.7%. Now, that's consequential, but it is also not like the earth suddenly moved, right? And if you look at the government data on this, the big jump in quit rates is for retail workers, where they doubled or tripled, and for IT people who can more easily move. In some industries, it's barely budged at all, right? So it's not an across the board thing in every organization, in every industry. The other thing we want to just remind you of are these surveys that say 3/4 of employees say they'll quit if they don't get blah, blah, blah. They always say that. So here's one from 2018 that said 59% of employees said they would take an identical job someplace else, that is, they would quit, just to get away from their boss. Now, the reality is they don't quit. The correlation between saying you're going to quit and actually quitting is extremely small. It's a few percentage points, right? And that is because people don't quit, partly because they can't. Now they can, which is a little different. So let me turn to that last slide here, and then I'll stop and see if we could talk a little bit and see what you folks are thinking, right? But just before we go, here's one of my favorites is there at the moment are 11 million jobs open, which is a lot. But it's also important to remember in January, 6 million people got laid off, right? Which we forget, There are vacancies sometimes because people quit, sometimes there are layoffs, and then a month later we come back and try to refill those jobs. So there's a lot of churn going on, which is typical, not good, but typical. And the fact that we're seeing this churn now is really not that unusual. All right, so let's see if we could answer this question about what's really different about workers now, employees now. Are they thinking differently? I think there is some evidence that they are, and here's why. The biggest factor holding people in organizations is social ties. Do I care about my boss, my immediate supervisor? Do I have friends who I feel are at work and I care about them and I want to see them? Those relationships are frayed, right? I have colleagues who have been hired since the pandemic started or beginning of the pandemic, so almost 2 years, I've never met, right? And I haven't seen most of my colleagues in 2 years, right? It's a whole lot easier to walk away from a relationship where you haven't seen people for years, right? And especially if you're working remotely and somebody is offering you an opportunity to work someplace else. And the only difference, as far as you can tell, is a new IP address, right? It's not that hard to quit. That's different, right? The other problem for employers is if we've been telling our employees that things have gone pretty well, surprisingly well, then the obvious question for them is, well, why can't we keep working from home? The reason this is so important is, at least the data I've seen, is that employers, the majority of them, say they think it's important to get people back in the offices. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, because remember, they have all the marbles. And unless they think it's going to work for them, I think that's where we're headed, is just bringing people back. And by the way, that is what has been going on, is that employers have been bringing people back. Twice as many people are back now as in the middle of the pandemic, often without a lot of systematic change in what they're going to do going forward. But the thing to remember, if you're on the employer side, is a little flexibility and control over people's time is really valuable to them. And we've just run this experiment and proved that you don't have to micromanage people and sit on top of them and watch them in their office for them to get their work done. So let me pause there and turn it back to Anna and see if you folks have some thoughts and observations, and we could talk about this. So Anna, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. As always, very provocative, and I really particularly like the way you kind of sliced and diced the data, because there's a lot of hype going on there. But if you actually look at historical data, you might tease out a very different story. And I think what you're presenting is a much more, granular view of how to think about the situation where we are in and dive a little deeper. So I would, I would like people to send in through the chat or the Q&A button, but we already have some comments, Peter. I think your point, first kind of more details here that I just want to answer people's questions. Your point about more meetings. For example, Kara here is saying what used to be just stop by my desk and casually chat now is an appointment on Zoom. And you have to, from the point of view of regulating the manager still or whoever, there's a lot more management of these types of meetings and interactions that is involved. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a great point. And the second part of it is, there are lots of those conversations that simply never happen because it is now more complicated to do. And I heard the head of PwC in the UK describing this problem, that he said that one of the big thing he noticed is there's no equivalent of somebody just catching him in the hall for that 20-second elevator pitch where they're telling him something, or they're asking him something that he can pass along to them. If you wanted to grab the head of PwC for 10 seconds and just ask him something quickly now, you have to schedule a Zoom meeting. And you know what? They're not going to put it on his calendar. It's something quick, it's something fast. It just doesn't happen anymore. So that is a pretty important insight. We do end up with more meetings, but we end up, I think, with just less communication, period, because it is so much more difficult to do that.
Yeah, and we still are going to see how it affects long-term relationships. I mean, some of the data from ONA, organizational network analysis, that's coming out is showing, as you pointed out, people who have been working together for a while, those strong ties have gotten stronger, and we might not have seen each other, but we've have the foundation,
Yep.
but the casual collisions that we were targeting for innovation, for creativity, for other, less task-oriented purposes, those are gone. There was one question from Christine, and I know, Peter, this is more in the related to kind of your background in labor relations. What do you think about this whole unionization trend with Google, Starbucks, and other? It seems like it's coming back. What are you thinking?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And Anna was pointing out, I began my career in looking at unions, and I became technologically obsolete, right? Because unions disappeared and there wasn't so much to talk about anymore. I think one of the big factors in modern times about unionization is that it's extremely easy for employers to defeat unions, right? And defeat organizing campaigns. And there's a lot at risk if you are the leader of an organizing campaign, right? And the evidence on this is quite persuasive that lots of people lose their jobs, right, as a result of that. So one of the things that is encouraged unionization in this very tight labor market is it reduces the fear that you're going to lose your job. Also, because the labor market is tight, the idea, if you're an employer, of trying to go through a fight with your employees, maybe your resistance to that is a little lower, right? So this is something that's not particularly new, and that is that unionization interests are kind of pro-cyclical, and because the employees have a little more power now than they have in a downturn, right? So I think that's what's going on. I don't think the employers are doing anything particularly new now that is causing a jump in interest. I think it's things that employees always were kind of irritated about. It's probably also fair to say, though, that it's easier to feel this inequity when you hear about opportunities elsewhere being so terrific. And, the news stories are talking about these things, right? The bonuses, the efforts to hire people and things. They're at the extreme. That's why it makes news, but nevertheless, they influence people, right?
Interesting. Shoshana is asking here what you think about what appears to be, again, in the media, and this is where we need to reality check, for organizations to be flattening in the structure because of the pandemic. Do you feel that there is this going to be, because people are all in the same, in the same Zoom, and they're a lot more casual, and they're bringing their pets and kids into the meetings, etc. Is there, do you see that this is kind of shortening the hierarchy gap and flattening organizations?
Yeah. So I think there's 2 points there, right? One is the hierarchy feel. And I think that did flatten quite a bit during the pandemic. I wonder what your all sense is about this now. I mean, one of the things I noticed, though, is that there's sort of less tolerance now for the dog barking on the Zoom call, and which just happens. My dog does bark during Zoom calls, or, the kids running through and interrupting the meetings, and particularly IT problems, which happen a lot. It's no longer, oh, don't worry about it. I mean, people are starting to get irritated. So I'm not sure that this, that kind of tolerance is going to continue. And I don't know that because of that, the kind of we're all in this together is going to survive in a hybrid model, right? Which did kind of flatten things. The bosses, I think, are going to be in the office, and their tolerance for problems that people have remotely Zooming and stuff is probably going to fall. I haven't heard anything about the organization chart flattening. I don't really see why that would happen. I mean, it's possible it might. I think supervisors become even more important because the kinds of things as a direct report that you might be able to pick up around the office and ask other people about, maybe, it's hard to get if you are not in the office. So you really have to rely on your supervisor more than in the past. And, that they're busy, those folks, so it's harder on them.
And I think, Peter, your comment about the new kind of management culture, new management style that needs to be evolved. We're just not there. We removed people from the office, but the same management skills are pretty much, in the textbooks, right? So how do you manage these people? That's an emerging awareness and emerging practice. Yeah, that's a very
and I think it's a great point. And Wayne has asked this too about performance management in the chats, that the best practice on this, which I think many employers did, was to require their supervisors to talk to their direct reports, to have a check-in, every week or so. And the difference there is people are talking about work, right? So in the office, I see my direct reports every day. And if you ask me, are you talking to them? I would say, sure, I'm talking to them all the time. Well, we're talking about, sports and Ben Simmons leaving Philadelphia, which of course is the big story here. We're talking about all weather, all kinds of things, but we're not talking about work that often. So what these meetings required of the supervisors is that you get on the video with your direct reports and you talk, not for long, but about work. Tell me about your projects. How are they going? And that is really important. I think that's one of the reasons in many places why satisfaction with supervisors increased, because we're not just around each other. We're not just chatting. We're really talking about work and trying to make progress on that. I hope that continues when people come back to the office. Anna and I had written about this earlier. We all understand we need to have more real work-based conversations and back and forth. It was forced during the pandemic and remote work. It was a good idea. I think that's kind of the essence going forward of kind of what we have to do. But it is pretty challenging to figure out how to teach supervisors how to know what it is remote workers need, because the remote workers themselves don't know to ask, when you're not in the office. What's up? What's going on? What should I know? What are the stakeholders thinking about this project I'm working on? You don't know what to ask. So it falls to the supervisors to do it. I don't think we've done a good job of helping supervisors much.
No, not yet. There are two questions, Peter, that I'm kind of folding together, one from Melissa Fisher and the other from Monica W. And it's about women. You mentioned this kind of discrepancy between the telecommuters and people who are going to be in the office, and that's specifically, the caregivers, let's put it that way, and people who are going to be primarily affected are women. So what are the ways, one question is how to meet the needs of the working mothers, let's say, or caregivers at the same time, and create that flexibility at the same time without going the legal route, right? Create opportunities and equity in both promotion, compensation, advancement, careers, and everything else.
Right. Well, this was another sort of media story. Early on, there was a lot of concern about labor force participation of women dropping during the pandemic, right? And even with remote work, it was dropping. And so there was this weird kind of conflation of those two things, thinking that somehow remote work was causing women to drop out of the workforce. And that wasn't true. I mean, it would have been worse without remote work, right? And what was driving that, of course, was what was going on in schools. The kids were home. And so somebody had to be home with them. And if you're working remotely, that was good in the sense that you kept your job, but it was bad in that you were driven nuts trying to do two full-time jobs at the same time, teach your kids, watch your kids, and manage the office, So some of that probably improves a lot now that most all schools, kids are back in school, right? Most of that sort of goes away. But I think the broader question, are we paying enough attention to caregivers? It's not a new problem, right? And it's not going to go away after the pandemic. And much of that is about flexibility, right? If you think about it, here's sort of a win-win. You look at the problem of sick leave, and many of us saw the stories a little while ago about companies trying to encourage their employees to take sick leave, right? And because they weren't doing it. Well, the reason they weren't doing it, of course, is because people weren't as sick. And also, even if you were home, like you were quarantined, you could keep working from home. So you didn't have to take sick leave. Why take it? The employers were concerned about you taking sick leave because for most of them, it's an accrued liability on their balance sheets. And so they wanted it off by the end of the year, right? Well, if we could have more work from home post-pandemic so that you don't have to take sick leave, if your kids are sick, do you have to take a sick day? And particularly if we are rolling sick leave and PTO days together, right? Then it creates this big disincentive to take sick leave because it's a day I could have used for something else important, some other emergency or something, right? So work from home provides a way for the employers of cutting back on the amount of sick leave people have to take. And for the employees, particularly a lot of white collar workers, they feel the need to get the work done anyway, somehow. And if they are sick and out of the office and they really can't work, or they're not kind of allowed to work, if you're taking sick days sometimes, allowing people to work from home would solve some problems there, right? So giving people more control over their work, being able to work from home more if they're sick or in other circumstances like that, would probably work for the employers as well, would probably save them some money, right?
Yeah, that's actually partly getting us to, I think, an excellent question here. If you can share what you think is the biggest positive that came out of the pandemic for the workplace that we can all kind of assimilate, integrate, and get better.
Yeah. Well, I think the positive is pretty clear. And that is, we ran this big experiment where everybody was working remotely. Lots of people, lots of managers believed before this that you could not trust your employees. And if you were not standing over them, they were not going to get their work done, right? And we ran that experiment. It turned out not to be true, that most employers, for most employees, said things worked incredibly well. One of the things that tells us going forward is that we really don't need to micromanage our employees. We could trust them a whole lot more than we do. We could give them more control over their time, which is really what they want, and they'll get stuff done, right? So one of the questions in the chat here is sort of asking about this. And I think the worst thing coming out of the pandemic are those employers who seemed not to take that lesson. And their view is still, it's not empirical based, this is kind of ideology, is still that people working from home, you can't trust them. So what we're going to put in place are more IT-driven monitoring, right? So we're going to have Tattleware and other software that tries to make sure that you're actually sitting at your desk and you're doing something, because we don't think we can trust you working from home. If you go in that direction, you defeat everything you gained and learned from the pandemic experience, right? And then it becomes a game. So you probably have seen some of these software things, like the monitoring stuff is trying to check to make sure you're at your desk and you're doing stuff. And so there's little software you can buy to defeat the monitoring, like it'll signal a jiggle of your mouse every few seconds. So it looks like you're there and you're doing something, right? Even if you're out walking the dog. I mean, it becomes a silly game. A third of Americans report that they put tape over the camera on their computers so the bosses can't be watching them. I mean, it's just silly. I mean, if you can't trust your employees, why do you have those people, right? And we just ran this experiment that you don't have to do that. So why didn't we learn that lesson? I think that's the worst thing. The best thing is there's the evidence. The worst thing is a lot of people seem to be ignoring the evidence. Ideology trumps experience, which is terrible.
And the final question, and then we will wrap up. What do you think about 4-day week, work week?
Well, this is again the question of what's in it for the employer, right? And the reason most companies have sort of office work is 9 to 5 is because their clients are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and their suppliers are Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or something like that, right? So then the problem is, if we are on a 4-day week, how do we make that work? So again, think about it from the employer's perspective. Why is this a good thing? There are places that do it, in healthcare. There are some nurses, including some I know, are on 3-day work weeks, the 12-hour shifts, right? And the reason there is because there's a sensible concern about continuity of care. I think it's better for the patients to have the same person watching them more. So they have a 3-day week. If you want a 4-day week, the question to ask yourself is, how does this help the employer, right? When most everything is on a 9 to 5 schedule, 5 days a week, and your employer moves to 4 days a week, how does that help them? And if you can answer that question and you think it does help them, then maybe you could move in that direction. I think the problem right now is it's not clear how it helps them to have a 4-day work week. And unless you answer that one, I don't see where it's going anywhere.
That's a great way to wrap it up. I think, the highlight of this conversation, Peter, with you is always just the insights and looking at data. You're just staring at what actually the data are telling us, rather than the media stories that capture some episodes and then blow them up. And some of it is evidence, but taking into consideration all those multiple points of view, and also checking on your own biases, right? Because we all have our biases about what works for us, and then we project it out into, and we see it in leadership a lot, right? This is why some leaders are very strict, very set on bringing people back, and some people are saying, we don't care, right? So that's phenomenal. All right, thank you all very much. What a great way to spend Friday afternoon. And I think, Nicole, we have some announcements. Peter, thank you very much. We have recorded this conversation. We're going to post it, and Peter generously will share his slides with us, so everyone will receive it. Here's the information on how to follow Peter, how to find him, and also follow his always very insightful comments. And we also, Nicole is posting in the chat that we have a significant discount on the book that Wharton Publishing is generously offering. And then we also have a slide on what's coming, the coming attractions. We have 2 more sessions. We're going to have here John Bedreau, Peter, who you know very well. John is coming out with a book on work without jobs. So we are going to have John here on March 2nd. And then on April 20th, we are going to talk about humans at work. And Peter wrote the foreword to my book. I will be presenting with my co-author Stella Lupershore on April 20th. So these are the coming attractions. I hope everyone will join us. And thank you so much, Peter. It's been such a joy to reconnect with you on this very timely topic. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.